Welcome, everybody. My name is Bill Brown, and I am the Executive Director for Prison Yoga Project, and I am very excited to kick off our 2022 webinar series with our first guest, Camellia, who I met through the Accessible Yoga teacher training last fall. And M is a co-founder of the Trans Yoga Project, as well as a staff member with the Accessible Yoga Training School. They are a trainer there, as well as and then on the association side, a blog editor, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're going to keep bio simple. If there's anything you'd like to add before we get started, you're welcome to do so, Em. But we're going to get to know you.
Yeah.
The course of this hour and a half that we have together this morning.
Yeah.
And I was reflecting on it this morning before we got started. I rewatched the presentation you did as part of the Accessible Yoga training, and I'm just realizing, like, there's this feeling of so much that we could talk about and we could get into, and it is not going to fit into the time that we have available together today. So I hope we at least get open up so that I think more people can get to know you and your work and your perspective, because it really jives with Prison Yoga Project and seeing what, in our community and our orientation from a unique perspective, and I think also a deeply rooted perspective. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Yeah. I can do a little bit of self-introduction as well to build on that. Like Bill said, I'm Camellia. My pronouns are they and them. And I'm coming to you from Nacotchtonk and Piscataway land, which was colonized as Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas. The Nacotchtonk folks who inhabited this space and stewarded the land, their population was dwindled through acts of violence and genocide during colonization. And so they were eventually absorbed into the larger Piscataway Nation, who is still on this land today. And of course, there's more deaths to that tragedy and that story. But if you're in my area, it's a little primer and you can Google that story as well. As Bill said, I'm the co-founder of the Trans Yoga Project. They founded that as a collective with 7 other folks from around the country, several of whom are in California and Los Angeles, a couple of whom are currently in North Carolina, and then our 8th founder, who had to step back, is in Louisiana. So I would love for you to check out the Trans Yoga Project site and get to know all of my collaborators there, because they're incredible as well, and also doing incredible work that would align with Prison Yoga Project's orientation and mission. I have worked with Accessible Yoga and with Jivana Heyman, the founder there, since 2018. I've been teaching yoga as my own business, doing both teaching to students previously in studio environments, and then moving into more community environments, teaching in shelters for folks experiencing homelessness in the DC area, as well as online now, of course, in this age, and working with private clients on sliding scale. So generally with folks who are under-resourced because they're experiencing systemic oppression, and just working on a sliding scale there to do some really individuated work, mostly around healing the trauma of oppression and regaining autonomy in your body. And I'm a consent educator, meaning that beyond just teaching yoga and yoga philosophy, I also teach a paradigm of consent towards creating a consent and agency-based culture that's liberatory for everyone. And so sometimes that's in yoga spaces. And I think, Bill, when we met, it was because I was presenting on consent and agency in the context of yoga for the Accessible Yoga training. And I also teach outside of yoga spaces on the same subject. And I am sort of when I have time working on my book about consent in a broader culture and about creating a culture of consent. So hopefully sometime in the future, maybe a couple years from now, you'll see that. But I'm currently working on a piece for a forthcoming anthology that's on this. My piece in it is on the same subject. So look for that a little sooner. And the accessible yoga training, which I see Blair dropped the link for, I will continue to give my guest presentation there for the accessible yoga training online. And I also am a mentor to the trainees there and lead some study groups throughout that training to work one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but in small groups with me. So I wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, it's exciting to me to hear that you're working on a book around consent and agency, and this is the topic that I think I really want to get into. Definitely one of the things that I want to get into in our conversation today. So we're going to come back to that.
Yeah.
But would you like to lead us in a little brief centering as we get started?
Yeah. So I'm of the mind that we can center wherever we're most comfortable. So for you that's seated, feel free to sit. If that's standing, if that's going to lie down for a minute, reclining in your chair, I don't know. I'm in the wrong chair. My other desk chair like leans back and it's brilliant. Find a comfortable position for your body, or as close to comfortable as you can get. And feeling supported, maybe putting your feet on the earth if they can touch the ground. And I like to take a grounded position with my hands on my thighs just to feel something tactily, but you're welcome to place your hands anywhere else that suits. And if you'd like to close your eyes, you may. If you'd prefer to just cast your gaze, maybe just down away from the screen, that's also welcome. And as you find that position of comfortable or close to comfortable, as close to supported and comfortable as you can get today in your body, just take a moment to check in with the body, maybe doing a brief scan of the body. I like to go toe up, so starting with your feet and maybe feeling the ground, whatever surface is under your feet, feeling that connection between your body and the floor, that connection between your body and the force of gravity, keeping us grounded. Then moving up to the legs and just noticing if there's anything that could be made more comfortable or supported by making an adjustment. And always feel free to listen to that cue in your body and adjust as needed. And then maybe notice your other limbs, arms, appendages, fingers, toes. And just check in, make sure your hands are where they feel comfortable and supported, your arms feel comfortable and supported, maybe connected to something. And then just take a moment to check in with your breathing spaces. And that can be by starting to turn the attention to the breath, but maybe focusing first on the physical experience of breathing, the sensations of expansion and contraction. Maybe you feel your muscles moving as you expand with the inhale. Maybe you feel other subtle shifts in body position or in your own energy. And then from there, from noticing the physical sensation of breath, you might move to maybe the more energetic sensation of breath, or to the air moving itself, that connection between the air around you that you're breathing in and the air that was within you that you're breathing out. I like to remember that breath is one of the ways that we're connected, that all of this air is expansive and spacious. It is space itself in many ways, and the air that I'm breathing is the same air that all of you are breathing. And then beyond being a point of interconnectedness, we could think about the breath as living metaphor, as cycle, right? Ongoing, even when we're not thinking about it, vital to our life and our energy. representative of all of the natural cycles, of the seasons, of the changes in our own bodies, that birth to death cycle. And take a moment just to notice your breath as it is happening. If you've already made adjustments to how you're breathing, that's great. Follow your body's cues, your breath's cues. But you could also just let your breath be natural and start to notice the qualities of that breath in your body today. It might be noticing the pace that you're breathing at. It could be noticing depth or where that breath is wanting to move in your body in whatever shape you've taken. Be noticing where you feel a little stuckness or where the breath doesn't feel like it's moving, and you're always welcome to adjust your body if there's a way you could create more space for the breath to expand, to flow. And then from that place of awareness of how the natural breath is in your body right now, having taken some of those notes for yourself, you now have all the information you need, the starting point from which to make agentful decisions about how you breathe. So you could choose with the knowledge that you have to take a slightly deeper breath, a longer breath, or a shorter breath, maybe a shallower breath, or to just update where you're sending that breath. That could be in sort of energetic or visualization, or maybe it's physical for you, but you could choose to send breath into your belly or into your ribs. And notice how even just having the intention of sending that breath, that prana, that life to a new space in the body changes the experience altogether. And take another moment or two to experiment with the breath, to explore the breath. If you've landed on something that's really serving you, of course, you're welcome to stay there and continue. But if you continue to take notes, if you continue to be aware of the sensations of breathing, and you notice something that you might want to alter, to change, you have that power. And then from here, again, you're welcome to stick with a natural breath or whatever form of breath you've been exploring. But I also like to invite an opportunity for sharing collective breath. And for me, that's through the practice of clearing breaths. So 3 deep breaths in through the nose, followed by big sighs out the mouth. And you're invited to join me in that if you'd like. Otherwise, stick with whatever breath feels good for you right now. If you want to join me, you can go ahead and take that deep inhale through your nose. And then sigh it out, let it go. And twice more like that if you're joining. Inhale. Let go. And one last time. And then invite your own natural breath back, the breath that your body naturally wants to support. And maybe take a moment to reattune to physical sensation, to all those same connective points of your body to itself, or your body to a chair or another surface, of your feet to the floor, the air against your skin. Notice any sensations that have arisen in your body, whether that is some kind of release or relaxation, or maybe it's tension, maybe it's a desire to move or a fidgety energy. And as we come out of this centering, I encourage you to let the body guide you. So if there's something that's calling to be moved first, that's more uncomfortable, maybe listen to that and adjust, start making some gentle movements and guiding your own sensation. And just like with the breath, as you start to move, You might notice new sensations arising, new information that you can integrate into how you come out of your centering shape and come back to space. So if you're noticing some neck tension, that could be shoulder rolls, it could be rolling the head side to side. If your arms just want to move or you want to shake your hands out, that's invited. If like putting some connective pressure on your chest, just tapping your chest or placing your hands over your heart or anywhere else on your body would feel good. Follow that inclination. And then as you adjust and as you feel ready to come back and orient to space and time as we're experiencing it, you're invited to maybe turn the head down, the gaze down, even if your eyes are closed, and to gently let light back in, fluttering the eyes open. And then as you start to come back to your space, maybe just taking a moment to scan the space around you and to reorient yourself to place into the things that you see that you've gathered around you in whatever space you're in. And then finally, we can reorient to the screen, to one another, to community and connection in this way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh. Um, it's always just like a revelation to me how much of a change it brings about when I am able to drop in and really drop into my experience, even just for a short while. Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, and beautifully led. Thank you. So one of the questions we like to start with is can you tell us just a little bit about some of your first experiences with yoga? Like, do you remember your first experience?
I do. I do
Most
distinctly.
people seem to.
Yeah. I was quite young. I was in high school. I have always been a person in a fat body. And that is true of a lot of my family. You know, we've got that kind of genetic build here, some German folks. And of course, I faced a lot of bullying and oppression based on body size, and was very, very indoctrinated into diet culture. Just rooted in all sorts. Of course, I know now of like other oppressive systems of white supremacy, of patriarchy, etc. But at the time, you know, was young and just, you know, as most of us do, learning from my parents what our attitudes towards our bodies were or were supposed to be, and kind of learning through society and all that messaging, all that internalization. And my mom was almost always on some kind of diet and was big on like finding ways to exercise, right? All related to weight loss, unfortunately, and not other kinds of empowerment and gain. It was all about like, what can I give up here? And so my first experience was taking a yoga class with my mother in a gym. And I absolutely hated it. I hated being in the gym environment, which was new to me. I was, you know, somebody who I enjoyed like dance classes and other really embodied movement practices, but that was not exactly how this class was being taught. It was very much being taught as a fitness class. And my body felt ill prepared. I had no idea what to expect and just felt really kind of terrible throughout the whole thing and never went back. And then my next experience was kind of deep in the land of diet culture and some disordered eating behavior and disordered exercise behavior. And so my next experience with yoga from there was finding my mom's Yoga for Fat Loss DVD, which was a thing that existed, and using it daily. For about a year. My last year of, I was dually enrolled in high school and community college when I was 16, 17. And so I had to go to like my high school campus in the morning, but then I'd have this lunch break and then I would go to the the college campus. And in between, I would like always do this DVD yoga practice. I put that in scare quotes. And then when I moved out at 17 and started school in Milwaukee, was there for a semester, but then went to Minneapolis. I just completely dropped any thought of yoga whatsoever. I was in a process of some amount of healing around the body at that time, and really was also like correspondingly in my first environment where I could explore my queer identity and my trans identity outside of the place where I grew up. And that was sort of my focus for a while. But then I moved around a little bit more. I left school, I went out to Portland and then down to San Francisco, where I was working at a major health science university and reading a lot of the research coming out, which of course, like, science is great. I'm a big fan of science, and also sometimes medical studies have bias, as hopefully we know. And certainly there was a big attitude of like fat phobia within that environment as well. And that sort of triggered a sort of relapse for me. And so my next experience with yoga was also in this context of like weight loss. I had started training for triathlons and half marathons at the time, and was like doing 3 times a day workouts. And somebody was like, you need to take a rest day. And that rest day should be active rest. And they were like, try a yoga class. And here I was like, I'd been doing like, all 3 disciplines required for triathlon, like every day, a lot of cardio, and went to this yoga class just at the closest studio to my apartment in San Francisco, which was just up this big hill. It was called Union Yoga. And I got really, really lucky, actually, because the first teacher that I had in a studio class, her name was Julie Watson. I think she's still in the Bay Area. I don't know her super well. I don't know her politics. I've certainly grown since then. This was back in like 2014. But she welcomed me into the class in my body at the size that it was, without any judgment, and just, like treated me like a beginner because I was a beginner, but not because, I was fat or because of anything else. She was also just like very highly trained and very knowledgeable about philosophy. And so was really teaching the yoga with the practice. And I will say I was physically humbled, even with the like cardiovascular shape that I was in at the time. But yeah, just a very new experience for my body that it really needed in terms of embodiment practice and like recognizing that there were sensations that I had just been tuning out or didn't even know I could experience through asana. And also then kind of learning about deeper connection and that journey within. So a lot of folks that I know who exist in larger bodies or in queer or trans bodies have not had great experiences with their first studio yoga classes, but I got really lucky in that regard. And I ended up just going to her classes, which were the like 6 a.m.s on weekdays and then Sunday at like 10. Like I went to all of those throughout my weeks. And then, slowly kind of started a transition away from the like heavy over exercise and the emphasis on weight loss and towards a more spiritual practice. And that continued when I moved to DC with my now ex-partner. I once again just found the closest studio to me, which was Capitol Hill Yoga on Pennsylvania Avenue, about 2 blocks down from the capital of the United States. I was doing work exchange there for classes, and it was a slow transition. I mean, that studio was still very much a like power yoga sort of orientation, a lot of like heat the room to 80 degrees and do some power vinyasa flow or something. But there were also some teachers there with some philosophy knowledge that helped me continue down that path. And eventually because I was working there. I became the manager there for a little while. They offered me a huge discount on teacher training, which I, of course, I think like many people also was like, well, it's heavily discounted. It's a lot of education. I'm in love with studying philosophy. I always have been. And that's what I really want to study. Like, so I'm going to go to this training where I'm going to get sort of an education in the yoga philosophy as well as these skills for teaching and practice. And that'll just be for me. It was before I even graduated from the training that a couple of the teachers at the studio who had like been anchoring the schedule for a variety of reasons. I think one of our colleagues got pregnant and was moving home to Missouri, and then another partner got restationed to Hawaii, so she moved out there. But they needed teachers who could teach the style of the studio like urgently, and it required this additional training and certification in the style that they were leading. So before I even graduated, they hired me to start teaching. And so I was teaching and managing that studio probably 6 months into my year-long training. And from there it evolved. I mean, I taught those studio classes. I taught that power style. I was not in a great relationship with my body yet, but it was slowly happening. And since then, I got certified in January 2016, so the very beginning of the year. And I started pursuing some continuing education. And one of the first things that I wanted to do was the accessible yoga training, which didn't happen immediately, but I did end up taking it actually with Amber Carnes in Virginia a couple years after that. And I also took the Yoga for All training with Amber and Diane Bondi. And there's just a lot of eye-opening happening for me. And at the same time, I had been a student organizer in college. I was like the chair of the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group chapter at my university, and doing a lot of other student activism and studying communications, but also gender and critical race studies and sexuality studies. And so I had gained a lot of influence from that. And I knew that like I already sensed something that didn't feel right about the way we were teaching and practicing yoga. And it took me, again, years to put a finger on what exactly it was for me that was feeling really off. And like part of that had to do with judgment of my body and of my identities. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that we teach contemporarily, like Western yoga in the United States, from this place of authority generally. Like there's a teacher at the head of a classroom who's commanding students. I was literally taught in my teacher training that offering options or being wishy-washy by like making it invitational instead of a command was going to be dangerous and was going to injure my students because they wouldn't be doing the pose right? Which is, it's bullshit. But like, you know, that is how I'd been trained and I didn't know better. But as I was practicing in those environments, I was starting to recognize like, wow, I actually feel disempowered in this space because I've got somebody up here creating a hierarchy and telling me what to do. And if I need to, you know, take a variation that really suits my body and my ability level, you know, that's not really offered to me. Like I'm having to really create my own practice anyway, because the teacher doesn't know how to teach me and my body. And also, you know, as a teacher, recognizing that like the philosophy was absent, not just in the class and like very literally absent from the teaching, but it wasn't embodied. Like I think that the language of the body is really, really powerful. Sensation is a really powerful language and teacher that our bodies speak. I have no problem with people who have an emphasis on asana in their practice, if that is the language that's really resonant for them and it translates well. Like I don't need everybody to be the philosophy nerd that I am and to be like reading the texts and really analyzing and getting deep. Really, like you can learn those lessons without any of the texts. You can learn those lessons from your body and from your breath. And so I respect that, but I don't think we learn them from the body or the breath when the experience that we're having is being taught from a place of authority that's outside of us and not within us, right? Which also just feels, in knowing the philosophy, like very antithetical to the history and philosophy of yoga practice and why this was developed and how it was developed, and the emphasis on autonomy and from learning from within and from understanding that like we are part of the divine and that everything we need is already within us, you know. There's a quote from the Gita that I love, and it's, I'm probably paraphrasing, not as Lauren's translation of it, but it says, you know, that one who sees God everywhere has no use for scripture. And I love that. Like, if we just tune in to all of the other ways that we can learn, you don't need to read and study the texts unless that's a language that speaks to you, right? You can practice yoga in relationship, and you can practice yoga in your relationship to yourself and your own body. And you can do that sort of physical self-exploration and also that mental exploration and that energetic exploration. And so now when I teach, I have a heavy emphasis on using the kosha model for just about everything, which I know you experienced from me, Bill, and my expanding on that. But like, I am always here if somebody wants to talk philosophy in depth, but also like I am here if you want to practice asana and get into your body. And like, that's a really, really powerful way to learn agency, to embody agency, to practice choice making, which we don't get to do in very many places. You know, we're in a society that is set up in hierarchies with people in positions of authority. That is true of like the traditional nuclear family model. That is true of the way we orient our schools with teacher and students. That is the way we orient most workplaces with a hierarchical business model. You've got your CEO and your middle management, and then your workers, you know, who are given different levels of importance, and that's reflected in compensation models and everything else. And like, it's how we orient almost everything. And so when we started creating a yoga industry in the West, right, like we modeled it after dominant culture. And that is exactly why it was not resonant for me and didn't feel empowering. It was like maybe for a while comfortable because it was recreating those hierarchical dynamics that de-emphasize consent and de-emphasize agency and de-emphasize that tuning into the body. Like, I was going to power yoga classes specifically to tune out of my body.
Yep.
Right? Yep. So I completely changed my whole teaching practice. Again, like I say it like it was an overnight thing, and to a certain extent it was. Like, my approach did change really, really rapidly, but also I was working in several contemporary studios, and it really took a couple of performance reviews where the owner was like, "You're not getting into sun salutations until 30 minutes into your 60-minute class, and that's not acceptable. You're taking too much time to talk and breathe." It took a lot of that for me to be like, okay, this is not really where I'm meant to spend most of my time. And to move on from that to the work that I do now, which, like, again, I teach a little bit of asana, mostly privately to sliding scale folks experiencing oppression, and in community environments, as I mentioned, when it's safe, when there's, I'm immunocompromised, so I can't be in shelter spaces right now, but you know, that's what I was doing with my teaching. And then I had really turned over to like teacher education at that point as well. So a lot of the teaching work that I do directly is with other teachers. And I do some then consulting with industry groups as well, which is, I also think of it as education, right? It's like community re-education on equity and inclusion, on teaching this consent model, and being in discussion with peers about different ways that we can be collaborative in the way that we structure yoga, and ways that we can take it out of the very capitalist, very hierarchical studio models and bring it out into the world.
Right.
Being in those bubbles.
Right. Can you Can you
Thank you.
say a little bit more about education? Because it's funny. Again, I listened to the talk that you'd given as part of the accessible yoga teacher training, and everything comes together at, I think, a really central point that is like crucial to yoga around this idea of agency. And um, uh, so yeah, can you say a little bit more about education?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I really had to rethink education. I grew up in public schools. I grew up in that model I was describing of like, there's the teacher who's the authority, who makes and enforces rules, and then also like gives me the knowledge that I need. And it really felt like transactional, right? And always has that. It's like, okay, here is someone giving me something that I didn't already have, right? And so over time, I've started to think a lot more about the role of the teacher and about like what it actually means to teach in the context of spiritual practice, or of being a person with a spiritual practice that emphasizes that like we have all the wisdom in us already. Like there's no teacher, there's no external person or authority who can give that to us, right? There are techniques that can be shared, there's experience that can be shared, there's stories that can be shared that function as tools and as means to remove barriers to accessing that internal wisdom and knowledge that we already have. But it's not about like a power exchange. I think of power and resources as synonymous, and knowledge or wisdom would fall into that as a resource, as a form of power, right? It's what you have to work with to exert, and it's that exertion then of the resources you have and how you choose to use them that is the piece that is agency, right? And as is liberation, and is part of consent practice. But I really think of the teacher now as somebody who's there not to give the knowledge. That would be, I mean, it feels to me also like very hubristic to assume that I have the knowledge that my students,
Right.
everybody's gonna get in at a different point and access different pieces. Like I am sure that there are students taking classes with me who have a lot more self-knowledge than I do, or a lot more depth of wisdom on certain things than I've ever been able to tap into. So really, to me, it's about providing a lot of tools to hold space, to like give that external permission, not because I should have to, but because I think a lot of people need it to like get started.
Right. Right. Right.
And then like only teaching with like self-exploration in mind, and a real emphasis on even what we did in centering of just like, what is your body saying? What is your breath saying? And like, those are the teachers here. I'm just the person who's here to like remind you to listen to your body, and to remind you to listen to your breath, and to offer a suggestion for how you might have a new experience in your body today, or a new experience of your breath today that could teach you something. But it's not me teaching you that. It's just me modeling like various tools that yoga practice offers that that I have practiced myself, and am able to sort of offer space for here.
Yeah.
And then anything you learn in those classes, anything that you feel like you gain in terms of power, it's really coming from you. It's not coming from me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anyone who, that's so beautiful. And I'm just thinking, anybody who, I've been trying to articulate this. I've been trying to articulate this, and somehow I cannot find the words to express it as so clearly as I feel you do. And to me, it really gets to the heart of what the whole endeavor of having a yoga practice is, in liberation. And this is what I'm hearing. I'm seeing a title that says agency and consent, which feels very social justice-y, as a title to a talk. And I'm hearing talk about the power and privilege And all of this, and what I'm hearing at the core of everything that you're saying really cuts to what I think the whole purpose of having a yoga practice is, and it's connecting to that, our own authority, our own connection into the divine. And then, you know, it seems from that your experience has led you to this, you know, question of, well, how can I create that opportunity for other people? And that this is what really, you know, and we look at it from the, you know, from the perspective of people who are incarcerated. You know, we move into these spaces where these power dynamics are absolute, and you're absolutely cut off from resources. You know, if you're the incarcerated person, you're the person who has power stripped of you, cut off from resources, then you're expected to somehow transform as an individual to fit something that better or that's more acceptable to society. And that is absurd.
Yeah.
And that's what our, you know,
Yeah.
I have to put it in, criminal justice system is based on. And so, you know, and here, so for Prison Yoga Project, it's like, well, how can we be the inverse of that? How can we be power leveling? How can we create access to resources? And how can we teach yoga? We call ourselves facilitators because we're there to create an opportunity for an experience for our participants to connect to their own authority.
Yep.
Yeah. And it just, you know, when I'm in the accessible yoga training and hearing you talk and hearing all of the other presenters and realizing that this is, you know, the experience of anybody who is marginalized is the best, I think, you know, that it's something that runs throughout our society. That's something that runs throughout our society.
Yeah. When I teach this, and again, Bill, you experienced this in my presentation, I use two drawings usually, like little renderings, and one is the koshas, right, like the sheaths of the body, where, you know, in terms of the philosophy of yoga practice and what we are doing here, it's like working from the outermost, the grossest, the macro that is the fish body itself, you know, through the various layers of our being, through our other bodies, until we hit that bliss, that atman, that divinity, and that truth. Like, I think one of the other epithets that I give to divinity or to God is just truth, you know, truth, love. I think these are all synonymous things, but like, we are working that internal journey in most of our personal yoga practices, right? And that's wonderful. We need that, because how are we supposed to orient to something internal if we haven't explored that internal landscape? And you were talking about this internal versus external authority, which I talk about a lot.
Right.
I made this term up. I don't know if other people use it or not, but I think of it as authority orientation. And I literally think of it as like kind of like you're holding this mirror, and you are always going to mirror whatever it is that you hold as authority, right? So like, you can face that outward, and you can mirror the dominant culture in the way that you come into the world, where you are looking for power, right? Where you're looking for status, where you're trying to climb some kind of ladder and create hierarchy, and be the person in the position of making the command, right? Of being the authority. Or you can turn it inward through whatever sort of practice gets you there. And like, for me, that is yoga. And I think yoga is the most potent thing I've encountered, but there are plenty of other practices that are meant to turn that around. And if you explore and you find something, if you find even just a little spark of that divinity or that wisdom or that self-knowledge, and you attune to that, to what you know in your conscience and in your heart is correct, you know, if you tune into the truth that is living inside of you, and you let that be the authority figure in your life, it changes how you behave. Like, then it comes back outward, right? If we're just internalizing, then we're just recreating the systems that have gotten us to where we are. But if we are practicing, if we're turning inward and we're reflecting that then back outward in our actions and what we do with our lives, like, not only do we tend to find more purpose within us than from other people, and like feel liberated in and of ourselves and feel much more satisfied, I would say content, like it's a Santosha practice too, of like, I know what my values are, and I get to act from this place that is rooted in deeply held values, which changes everything from I'm going to act from this place of like reflecting back what external authority figures have told me and just recreate these systems, right? And so that is what I think like we all need to be doing. And I think, of course, in an environment like a prison where like externalized power, sources of power, like the material resources, which we could think of as like money or like social status, like that kind of stuff's going to be either like, you know, on its like micro scale in that enclosed bubble environment or non-existent. And so like, you know, it is very much one of the most, I can't think of many more disempowering positions to be in terms of that resource access, as you were saying. And I, you know, I don't think that finding the agency within you in that environment solves everything by any means, right? But I do hope that, you know, even in that environment, being able to tap into a sense of like, I have control of my breath, like that is mine. And, you know, in most of these moments anyway, hopefully like I have access to that and control over that. Like the little things to hang on to, the little embodied things in a practice to get into a deep sense of values, like that is transformative for folks. And like, I don't mean that as any kind of like judgment on why anybody is incarcerated. Like I'm an abolitionist. I don't think anyone should be incarcerated, but like I know that when I tap into that and I listen to that authority from the truth that I have maybe just baby gleamed from my practice at this point, like I show up in the world understanding a lot more about human nature and a lot more about need and about desire and about relationship and like how I know I deserve to be treated, which helps me to understand how others deserve to be treated as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in ways that are consensual and reciprocal and mutual and collaborative. We're a social species. Like not only are we looking through a yogic lens that tells us that we're interconnected, but also like we really get to feel that and know that and embody that when we are in that part of ourselves that recognizes our own need for connection, right? And if I'm tapped into those values, I can show up in any space and I can filter any situation, even the challenging ones, through that system of values and determine how I need or want to show up and respond. And I get to bring a lot more intention. And that's the other part of the agency, right? Is like acting with intention. You need a why. It's not just like I have these resources. It's like, why am I making the choice to use them the way that I am? And so I think that there is, you know, in this context, that opportunity to tap into inner wisdom, inner authority, and to have that be a sort of safe space that can continue to be cultivated, like for just that practice of choice making. And that's especially important when you don't have any other opportunities for that. And then, you know, outside of prisons and other, you know, very like on that end of the spectrum of control, right? Even out here within the police state that we live in, or
Right.
you know, the government system that we have, that's also very much a hierarchy.
Right.
Systems of oppression that we have, it's so important. And of course, we also know that like folks who have experienced oppression and multiple forms of oppression are vastly overrepresented in the folks who are in the carceral system. So like there's a layering effect there,
Yeah.
right? Like for me as a trans person, this has been really, really, really important. For me as even as a white person who is working on racial justice, and like one of the roles I have had is working with Susanna Barkataki's training to hold white ally space to explore like the diversity of our own whiteness and those internalizations and become better allies and accomplices in racial justice work. But like that requires a real depth of exploration of privilege, which is also power, right? Like it's an analysis of our resources. And the first thing that I ask people to do is to make a resource inventory and let that be like expansive. It's not just like, well, I have this much money in my bank account and I have a home that I own or an apartment that I rent, or like I have a car. Like those are resources and those are forms of power, absolutely. And so are all of the bits of wisdom you've gleaned throughout your life. So are the experiences that you have in your memory. So are all of the facts that you remember from your own study, whether that's like book learning or it's life learning or it's spiritual text or it's, learning through any of those various languages. And when we have that, when we tap into that, we get to make choices. And it's those choices and those values, it's using that root value of self-sovereignty and love and truth that is going to change everything. Like that is what's going to change everything. Like, I really think that if we want to create a just society, if we want to undo the systems of oppression that we've built, if we want to abolish prisons, if we want a government that's actually going to function and serve people, if we want a government at all, or like how we want to be in society and in community, it has to start from a place where the individual is empowered. It has to start with the self-work. It has to start with reflecting on the power that you hold, the position that you hold, and then bringing that out with you into any work that you do, whether you're a yoga instructor or facilitator, or you are working in healthcare, or you're working in research, or you're working in government. Like I said, my first studio in DC was on Capitol Hill. That's the first place that I taught. I had like senators come to class because we were right by the Senate offices in the Capitol building, like people with immense power in this country coming to these classes. Like what a platform we have. I don't think that a lot of teachers, like of any ilk, but certainly yoga teachers, understand the power that you have as somebody who is holding this space and has the opportunity to invite people into that space. And you can use that in a few different ways, right? Like anything, that position is neutral. Like power is not bad, nor is it good. It is fact. And you can choose to use that to like take power over, right? And teach by command and just reinforce the systems that got us here already. Or you can use that power to hold space, to find creative tools and solutions that help people access new experiences that are going to be their teachers, right? And that's where like the accessible yoga stuff comes in for me. It's like, certainly it's part of like a disability justice framework and comes from my fat liberation activism and wanting everybody to have like the tools they need and the reduction of stigma in the environments to access practice at all. But I am here about like adaptation for every individual, regardless of ability level, body size, or any other factor, right? I'm here to say like, you can choose today to not go all out. Like you don't need to push today. We might be in a vinyasa class and you can sit on your ass if you want to. Like I encourage it. When people just stop in the middle of the practice and lay down for a while, I'm like, you
listen to yourself. Yeah.
You got it. Like that is what we are here to do. Thank you so much, like for teaching me and teaching everybody else by your example, because there's like nothing more powerful than being in a room with somebody that is presumed to be authority and doing something else.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I feel like I could just say, can you just say more and say more and say more? I mean, we
No, it's more.
we have to have a series. Um, so oftentimes, I mean, there's 10 things in there that I would love to pull out,
Yeah.
just to stay with the one in the moment. So often we'll go into a space, and of course the folks that come into the practice space inside the prison, the first thing, in most cases we try and make it voluntary, that but sometimes we will get a situation where, like, group of veterans that they put together in the same housing unit, and then they all have to do the same programming together, because that's part of the deal. You get to live in here and they let you have access to the TV remote, but you got to do all the programming. And so they come into the yoga room, and it's like, I know that not everybody wants to do yoga, and that's fine. And so I say, well, look, I understand that you're here, you're required to be here, but that's it. And however you want to show up in this space, I would love for you to give this a try. But however you show up, that's what's right for you. And then the deputies will come in and say, show up, get up off your mat and show some respect. This person comes all the way up here to do this for you, and and I'm like, no, 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 no. We have to explain, this idea, to them. Another thing that just really stands out to me is this idea of layering, because one of the things, one of the things that I think I want everyone on the planet to come through Prison Yoga Project's foundational training, and because I think that what we see in a prison and a jail is like the breakdown of the social fabric, and as the result of the hierarchical positioning and taking power over, and how that works against our highest potential as human beings, as social creatures. This is it's one way to be social, and it's one way to get shit done, but it winds up causing a tremendous amount of harm for a lot of people, and the harm just rolls down,
Yeah.
rolls down the hill. And so it's like, well, look at prison, and you see this distillation of things that are happening in society in gross ways and in very subtle ways, in the police state, and also in the way that you're interacting with your person who's making your coffee, and then and also in yoga studios, where it is really a very, the way we were taught to lead a yoga class, with rows of mats all facing in one direction, with an authority figure, who is telling you what to do with your body. And like you were mentioning, in your vinyasa classes, it's like you're there to tune out. And I realized that, I recognized this in my own practice, because it was a heated vinyasa studio with, the temperature, the humidity, the music, that all these external hooks that I could put my awareness on, and it made me feel good, because the activity created a chemical circumstance within my brain and body that felt good. And I'm like, oh, I was addicted to the experience that I was getting out of that yoga class. And when I feel like now, when I'm really paying attention, oftentimes I feel uncomfortable. I'm aware of, injuries that I've had that are still pain in my body. And it's not always a blissful experience to be practicing yoga, but it's authentic, and it's connecting me into the reality and the truth of my experience.
Yep. And you get to choose, like, I want I think discomfort, right, is important. Like in our social justice work, you know, it's going to be uncomfortable to unlearn white supremacy, especially as a white person, right? It's going to be uncomfortable
Yep.
to like figure out the whole gender thing. You know, like I know people are very uncomfortable with my pronouns sometimes, or like with what I have to say about sex and gender and all of that in my work with Trans Yoga Project and individually. But like, that's important discomfort, and there can be important discomfort in the body as well, and important discomfort in the breath as well. But also sometimes you don't need to be uncomfortable. Sometimes that is not the most, like the thing that serves the best, right? And that's why I'm like, you know, I don't expect anybody here to find ultimate comfort in anything that you're doing, and that's okay. You can choose to make yourself more comfortable, or you can say, this is a moment where I feel resourced enough to face my discomfort, and you can opt into that, right? But I never want to create an environment anywhere where I am like, it's only going to work if you're uncomfortable, because that's when people get competitive. That's when people get like out of their body so that they don't have to feel the discomfort, but like are in very uncomfortable, like pushed positions. That's where I see injury happen if it's an asana context.
Yeah.
Like it is important to resource yourself in whatever ways you need and can, right? Depending on where you are in the world and in your environment, before trying to face anything that's going to be uncomfortable, right? Like, you have to be able to manage that discomfort. You have to be able to process that discomfort and like process through discomfort. That takes skills, that takes preparation, that takes energy. And, you know, a lot of times I rarely practice with a teacher anymore other than myself. Like my practice is very solitary right now. Partly pandemic related and my immunocompromised state and like not being able to go be in groups of people. But also even before that, it was mostly a home practice that I did alone. And that's because I don't need any external influence. And a lot of my movement practice ended up being like dance or ended up being just like sitting in my chair and like, oh yeah, my neck kind of feels uncomfortable. Is it because I need to work on some stability here? Like I have spinal inflammatory arthritis. That's yeah. So like I'm uncomfortable all the time. I'm in chronic pain. And it's like, is this like I need to push through that and do some of these like neck strengthening exercises so that I can increase my comfort later? Or is this a moment where I need to like just put the hot pad around my neck and lay down and take shavasana, you know, like, and both are, they're different experiences and they both have a lot to teach me.
Yeah. Okay. We got 20 minutes. I want to open this up to some questions from the folks in the room.
Right.
And I'm not good at looking at the chat when we're having a conversation. So I haven't seen chats. If there was a question in the chat and I'm missing it, I apologize. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A, and if you've got a question, I'd love it if we could use the Q&A, because then I will be able to mentally track it. Maybe we can keep
I'm just
scanning the chat. So I also love working with somebody who's experienced in leading these online.
Just a lot of support. Great. Love it. It's everywhere.
So we have a question from Lorraine. Can we hear more specifically about consent?
Yes, absolutely. I love talking about consent. I think the important starting place when you want to talk about consent is power, and that's what we've sort of been talking about, I think, because the act of consenting, so everything we've been talking about is like power on the individual level, the resources that one person has to exert. When we're talking about consent as a practice, we're talking about relationship. We're talking about two individuals with their own power who are now interacting and having a power exchange, or there's a power dynamic in any relationship. And that can be the relationship of like, I've never met you before. There's still a power dynamic there, right? Or like your most intimate relationship with a partner or with family or with really close friends or your children or whoever. Like there is always a power dynamic and always a, it's always in flux. It's always a negotiation. Using a consent framework for negotiating that power exchange starts with understanding your power, right? So it starts with what we've been talking about with that internal work of knowing what your social positioning is, like where do you hold privilege in society, right? It's also like just knowing yourself. It's knowing your self-worth. It's knowing your values. It's knowing what you feel like your purpose or your calling is. It's knowing like what you have in terms of material resources to give. And then also in a lot of relationships, it's about like, what energetic resources do I have to give right now? And so that's part of that like resource inventory that I'm always trying to keep like even in my head, right? So that when I am with a friend and that friend asks me like, hey, I'm having a really, really hard day. Like it's related to, you know, a beloved family member who's ill and who I'm worried about. Like I get the opportunity to say like, yes, I have the energy for that. And I can say that from a place of honesty rather than a place of like societally enforced obligation of like, okay, somebody needs something and I need to say yes because they're my friend and there's a prescribed dynamic here, right? So when we're talking about consent, it's really, really about knowing your own resources and then also knowing your own needs and knowing your boundaries. So like we need the personal practice. It starts with the individual. We don't have community unless we have a bunch of individuals, right? And then from there, I use a framework for consent that has 4 tenets, which is clarity, that consent is always clear. So there's a shared language, like, you know, that can be a spoken language. It can be a body cue. It's whatever's agreed upon, as long as it's understood between both parties in the interaction, that is shared language, and that is clarity. There's coherence, which means that like both people are in a state of mind and a state of being where they can understand what's being asked of them. And that could have to do with like, you know, mind altering substances or, you know, being asleep, right, is a change, or like could be sort of that like mental, emotional energy, having enough focus and attention left, having enough steam left to really understand. And it could be like having enough context, having enough information. And so like it's part of informed consent to me also, of like, you know, if you're going to ask somebody for something or to do something, it is making sure that they have the full breadth of information about that request. And that also speaks to the next tenet, which is willingness. And so like consent is always given freely and willingly and never under threat or coercion, manipulation, that sort of thing, right? It is being really honest about exactly what is intended, like what you want to do, what you want the outcome to be, and what the circumstances are around that, what the risks might be around that. Like it is that full spectrum of information, because all of those different points of information might change somebody's willingness to do something, right? Like there's a big difference between somebody like asking to, I don't know, asking to kiss me in my own home in private, and then like, you know, a stranger asking me the same question like on a bus, right? Like that it's the same question, but it's different circumstances. And like, so that's the willingness. Any of those things could change, and that could change the willingness. And then that speaks to the last tenet, which is that it's always ongoing. Consent is always ongoing. It is always revocable if a circumstance changes, which can include like oh, I'm just not feeling it. It can include like, oh yeah, I was into this, but I got kind of tired. It can include like, hey, yeah, I know I agreed to going out to dinner with you tonight, but I just realized that I have this bill due and I actually like can't afford to go to that restaurant or whatever, like consent can always be revoked at any time. And that is sort of that is the process of being in consensual and mutual relationship. And that's where like having that really deep value of like, I know my worth and my boundaries. And I also know like I know that, which helps me know that the same thing exists for everybody else and that I want that for everybody else, right? Like I want my friends, my loved ones, and strangers to all have that same sense of self-care, self-love, of like boundaries and being able to set them and being able to say no to me and to anybody else. To really have that freedom, like that is the liberation off of the mat and like externalizing. That's the part where like we take what we learned from practice and we bring it into the world, right? And it radiates from the like most micro relationships that we have interpersonally with our beloveds out into society, right? Like we are a catalyst, we are a model. And if we practice this in those small, close relationships, that radiates out, like that builds community. And then that community, if we all agree to the same sort of practices and we continue to work on this like consensus-based model, like my collective with the Trans Yoga Project, we use, we're a horizontal, all of the founding members, like no one, we don't have a hierarchy. We work collaboratively and by consensus within our own frameworks. Like that is a community that was built on these principles. And now we actually operate that way. And we bring that into all of the work that we then put out into the world. So now when we like teach a course, that's going to be an inherent thing that we build into that course. And that becomes part of what is being shared with a broader audience that can take that back to their relationships and their communities, right? And that's where we get this spread. That is where we get this creation of a consent culture, which is what I focus on, is like, how do we start small to radiate out? What does that look like? So that we aren't just doing the like individual spiritual liberation work in our yoga, but we are actually also doing the tangible liberatory work out in the world. And that like that's important to me. Like it's important to me that my individual relationships with Bill, which even with people that I work with my partners, with my friends, with my family, that like those are liberated relationships. And then as we build community and invite new people in or encounter other communities or people, that we can practice that with additional individuals and offer that same sort of freedom and liberated relationship and opportunity to make choices. And that of course also extends to like students, right? And in these environments specifically, like I care that you are as liberated in your body as possible right now in whatever environment that we are in. And I'm not here to hold power over you. I'm here to make an offering. I'm here to ask a question and you get to say yes or no, or something in between. I've got maybe tattooed on my chest between my yes and my no. So like,
You mentioned your willingness as a part of consent, that it's given willingly. This is something that I think becomes so complicated when we're working in that prisoner jail environment, because you have so many forces, like like I was mentioning, 1 hour a week, these guys get to say, no, I don't want to practice yoga. And, 23 hours and the other 6 days in the week, that they don't have that option to say no to anything oftentimes. And the environment itself creates these hierarchies where fear and intimidation and coercion happen between people who are incarcerated and between the officers and the people, the residents. And you, when you see this over a person living in that environment for decades, our nervous system adapts to the environment. And if you're living in that environment, then saying no feels incredibly uncomfortable, I believe, for a lot of the people who show up.
Yeah.
you know, and yeah, it just becomes something that I think we need to be like hyper aware of, that aspect. I mean, but really, that stands out now, but tomorrow the aspect of power in that may stand out more. So Blair would love to know what books and other resources have had like an impact on
Yeah,
your work.
totally. I mean, I mentioned that I'm a philosophy nerd, so absolutely, like, yogic texts have had influence of all different kinds. Like, they've given me things to percolate on that I'm like, I question sometimes and I'm still working through, or working through some resistance to, as well as like depth of inspiration and depth of understanding. And so I would put the Gita towards the top of that list, of course. And my favorite translation is Eknath,
Yep.
which you'll see is like dog-eared, and like if I shake it, like pages might fall out, because some of my favorites are like, it's falling apart. Like, is a beloved.
Well done.
I I also get a lot out of the sutras, and I've read several translations of the sutras. I learned some like fascinating things, especially from the beginning portions, even of like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, if you're a Hatha Yoga practitioner. Like, that's one that I've done kind of deep textual study with a guide, and gotten like some real interesting stuff from. There is, of course, like a lot of other like fascinating kind of historical, but also then like the less of the asana practice. There's a lot of pranayama. I mean, it's a lot of practice, right? It's one of the first texts where we see a lot of practice offered there. And then beyond yoga texts strictly, I am a student of Black intersectional queer feminist lineages. And so for me, that's Audre Lorde has had a huge impact. I am always going back to her essays. The essay that is actually my favorite is also featured in Adrienne Maree Brown's Pleasure Activism, which is another book that's had a huge influence on me. Basically anything from Adrienne Maree Brown, I've read all of them, including We Will Not Cancel Us, which is a book about transformative justice, and Emergent Strategy, which is also sitting right next to me, which was the sort of first and came to me at a really important moment in life. I get a lot out of speculative fiction work, particularly those of queer women authors, and Octavia Butler, of course, being like a very primary one. I have an Octavia quote on my wall that says, "Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing," that has been like hanging in my workspace as a sort of personal motto to work with for the last like year and a half, and still active. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other incredible books and authors that I would recommend. I do a lot of reading, but I would start there with like Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown's work, some Audre Lorde, some Alexis Pauline Gumbs has a really beautiful book that came out last year called Undrowned, which is really prose, and it's like learning liberation through marine mammals, which is part of that kind of emergent strategy concept of learning from all of the different teachers in the world, including nature and the natural world and the other species. And then lastly, I would say Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer is the other like must read on my list. So definitely those are the books with the big influences for me. And I'm also big on podcasts. And so Adrienne Maree Brown has a podcast with Autumn Brown, one of her sisters, called How to Survive the End of the World. And that's incredible listening for anybody who is interested in any of the things we've discussed, and accessible on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and I think on their own website as well. So yeah, I could talk about yoga authors. My dear friend, Jivana Heyman, who founded Accessible Yoga, just put out his second book. Like his first book, Accessible Yoga, is great, but it's really like a guide to accessible asana practice in many ways, with a little bit of philosophy and pranayama and stuff put in there. But the second book is barely any practice. There's some like meditations and a couple of little seated practices at the very end offered. But it's really a book about philosophy and creating revolutions for social change and justice through yoga, which I worked with him on that. I was the first reader and gave feedback, which was really a great experience. And I was featured in a little section, so you'll see my face and my little quote in there too. And I also haven't finished it yet, but Jacoby Ballard, who's also a friend and colleague, another trans teacher who's working a lot in like white ally spaces, who I worked with on that training with Susanna, just put out a book called A Queer Dharma, which is yoga and meditations for liberation. And I can't plug that enough, even though I haven't finished it yet, because like it's incredible. It's incredible. They're incredible. I could go on and on. I mean, I could, yeah.
This is like,
I'll just list.
do you know bookshop.org?
Yeah.
You should start a bookshop.
Mm.
I mean, I don't, you do what you want to do, but I think a curated list of books and resources recommended by M would be something that I would love to go and check out and explore.
I think I will do that. Maybe when we get off of this webinar.
It's easy to do. It's easy to do. If not, we'll have a curated list too. You can add it to the Prison Yoga Project bookshop, but I want you to get the benefit from it. So
Sure.
It's 10:30 my time.
Yep. 1:30.
We've run out of time.
Till next time then.
Yeah, until next time. Is there anything I am going to, hopefully Blair will drop the link to, and I notice Bethany has dropped like the titles of the books that you were mentioning into the chat, which is fantastic. Thank you. You know, and accessible yoga, and then I don't know if you mentioned the title of Jeevana's new book, Yoga Revolution.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so I'm hoping that Blair will drop a link to the accessible yoga teacher training, which is starting on the 20th.
Yeah, it's coming up soon. It's in a couple weeks at the end of January. And I will be guest teaching my consultant agency workshop there as well. And I will also be kind of assisting throughout the whole training and chiming in as Jeevana is leading stuff and also doing that mentorship role. So there's some smaller group study group opportunities with me. So absolutely go take that training.
I can't recommend it highly enough. And I just feel like the more perspectives we're getting, this, I mean, so well aligned with the view that Prison Yoga Project holds and approached from a slightly different perspective with absolutely the best teachers and facilitators you can imagine. Yeah, it's fantastic. Please take it.
Yeah, it's grown so much since the pandemic, because it used to be just in person, so you'd get one instructor, which is great.
Yeah, exactly, right.
But you want to take it with every single person. Like you want to take it with Jeevana, you want to take it with Amber, you want to take it with Kelly Palmer, you want to take it with me, because like it's different through everybody's different lens, right?
Yeah.
It's really great online because we all get to then be there and present pieces and interact. So absolutely. I just put the like URLs to my collective's website, transyogaproject.com. We also have a Patreon to support, or there's a donate button on our homepage.
Oh, good.
And then my site, this will currently forward you to foundspaceyoga.com, which was my like very original brand, right. But working on a website redesign. So this will redirect you to the current website and will eventually take you to the new website once it's up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I can't thank you enough. And yeah, until again, I'm really looking forward to our next conversation, and hopefully to being able to do a little bit of work together on another project that we've talked about. So yeah, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the space and the time, and for everybody who showed up on Facebook and on Zoom and who will see this later.